The carpenter was unjustly accused, but a discovery changed everything. His response transformed the mansion's destiny. John Baxter is a single father struggling to support his son, Peter. When he receives an offer, he can't refuse to work at the most powerful mansion in New Haven. He doesn't realize he's about to face the greatest challenge of his life. What starts as a promising job quickly turns into a nightmare, with dark secrets emerging and enemies appearing from where he least expects. Amid sabotage and accusations, John must find the strength to overcome adversity and uncover the truth. But is he ready for what comes next? John Baxter was a respected carpenter in the small town of New Haven. At 38 years old, he had already faced many challenges in his life, but the greatest of all was being a single father to his 8-year-old son, Peter. The loss of his wife, Anna, in a tragic car accident 3 years earlier, still left deep scars on John, who found himself struggling daily to balance his work and domestic responsibilities. John tried his best to provide Peter with a decent life, but the pain of Anna's absence was a constant shadow. The small house where they lived was modest, but John made sure to keep it in good condition. He took pride in his carpentry work, a trade he inherited from his father. His skill with wood was a family tradition, and John approached each piece with a passion that few understood. To him, carpentry was more than just a means of livelihood. It was a way to honor his father's memory and keep alive his connection to the past. Although respected by the community, John's financial life was tight. The money he earned from his commissions barely covered the monthly expenses, and he often found himself worried about the future. John dreamed of providing a better life for Peter, but opportunities in the small town were limited. He spent sleepless nights thinking about how to improve his situation, but always came back to the same conclusion. He needed a more stable job. This opportunity arose unexpectedly on a sunny autumn day. John was repairing a client's fence when he was approached by Mrs. Isabella, one of the richest and most influential women in New Haven. Mrs. Isabella was known for her imposing mansion atop the hill, a symbol of wealth and power in the region. The mansion, built in the 19th century, was a work of art but was beginning to show signs of decay. Old furniture needed repair, and the house's structure required careful restoration. "John, I've heard great things about your work," said Mrs. Isabella, in a tone that mixed authority and kindness. "I need someone competent to restore some furniture and carry out repairs on the mansion. I know the job will be extensive, but I'm willing to pay well." John was surprised by the proposal. Working at Mrs. Isabella's mansion could be the answer to his financial problems, but he also knew the challenge would be great. Mrs. Isabella's reputation as a demanding woman made him hesitate. However, the prospect of a higher salary and the chance to secure a better future for Peter weighed heavily on his mind. "I'm honored by the invitation, Mrs. Isabella," John replied, trying to hide his apprehension. "It will be a pleasure to work on your mansion. I'll do my best." Mrs. Isabella smiled, satisfied with his response. She knew John was the right person for the job, and the determined expression on his face confirmed her expectations. That night, when he returned home, John found Peter playing in the yard with a wooden toy car he had made himself. Watching his son, John felt a mix of pride and responsibility. He knew he needed to make the right decision, not just for himself but especially for Peter. "Peter," John called out as he approached his son, "I received a very important job offer today. I'm going to work at Mrs. Isabella's mansion. This means I'll have to spend more time away from home, but it also means we could have a better life." Peter looked at his father with curious eyes. "Are you going to fix big things there, Dad?" "I will, son," John replied with a smile. "It will be a tough job, but I believe it will be worth it." In the days that followed, John prepared to start working at the mansion. Upon arriving for the first time, he was greeted by Alfred, the property manager. Alfred was a tall, thin man with a stern expression that seemed to judge him from the first moment. Alfred's cold reception contrasted with the warm job offer made by Mrs. Isabella. "I hope you meet the expectations," Alfred said as he led John through the mansion's long corridors. "Mrs. Isabella is very particular about everything related to this house." "I'll do my best, sir," John replied, keeping calm in the face of the manager's coldness. He knew it wouldn't be easy to earn the trust of the mansion's staff, but he was determined to prove his worth. In the first few days, John immersed himself in the work, restoring old furniture, repairing doors, and fixing the mansion's roof. He knew that every detail mattered and worked hard to leave everything impeccable. His talent quickly caught the attention, not only of Mrs. Isabella, who made frequent visits to the workshop to check on the progress, but also of the other employees. Some admired his skill and dedication, while others, like Alfred, began to show signs of envy. Over time, John began to bond with some of the mansion staff, particularly with Mrs. Maria, the housekeeper. Mrs. Maria was a wise woman with many years of experience and always treated John with respect and sympathy. She noticed the tension growing between John and Alfred and, in a discreet conversation in the kitchen, offered advice to the carpenter. "Be careful with Mr. Alfred, John," she said with a tone of concern. "He doesn't like to see others standing out, especially if it could affect his position here." John thanked Mrs. Maria for the advice but decided not to let it distract him. His focus was on securing a future for Peter and proving himself worthy of trust. However, little did he know that the peaceful days were numbered and that a storm was brewing on the horizon, ready to shake all his certainties. The first days of work at the mansion were peaceful, but John couldn't help noticing that there was something strange in the air. The mansion, though grand, had a heavy, almost oppressive atmosphere. John noticed that, besides Alfred, other employees also seemed suspicious of him. The furtive glances and whispered conversations in the corridors were signs that something wasn't right. Alfred, for his part, never missed an opportunity to show his disdain. Whenever he could, he made sarcastic comments about John's work, subtly questioning his competence. One particularly tense afternoon, while John was restoring an old frame, Alfred appeared in the workshop with a malicious smile. "John, I hope you're being careful with these materials," Alfred said, feigning concern. "Some of them are more valuable than they seem, and it would be a shame if something happened to them." John, who had been trying to ignore the provocations, stopped what he was doing and looked directly at Alfred. He knew he needed to stay calm, but the constant insinuations were starting to get to him. "I always take great care, Mr. Alfred," John replied, controlling his tone. "I know the value of what I'm handling." Alfred gave a cold smile and left the workshop without saying anything else, leaving John with an uncomfortable feeling. Alfred's words sounded like a threat, and John couldn't understand why the manager seemed to take such pleasure in provoking him. In the days that followed, the situation worsened. Tools began to disappear, only to be found later in unusual places, and pieces of wood that John swore he had left in a specific corner of the workshop appeared elsewhere. John knew something was wrong, but without evidence, he couldn't accuse anyone. He decided then to be more vigilant and avoid any confrontation. He continued working with perfection, and his efforts did not go unnoticed by Mrs. Isabella, who frequently praised his dedication. "John, you're doing a magnificent job," said Mrs. Isabella during one of her visits to the workshop. "The mansion has never been so well cared for." "Thank you, Mrs. Isabella," John replied humbly. "I'm glad to know you're satisfied." However, the more John excelled, the more Alfred's envy grew. The manager, who had initially only been suspicious of John, now saw him as a direct threat to his position at the mansion. The fear of losing his status began to consume Alfred's thoughts, and he decided he needed to take drastic action to protect his place. Alfred then had a devious idea. He knew that the mansion's storage rooms contained valuable materials, such as rare woods and precious metals, used for restorations. He decided to plant small pieces of these materials in John's workspace, ensuring that no one noticed them until it was too late. Alfred began spreading rumors among the other employees, insinuating that John was taking advantage of Mrs. Isabella's trust to steal materials. Gradually, suspicion began to spread throughout the mansion. Some employees, who had previously respected John, now looked at him with distrust. One morning, while having coffee in the kitchen, John overheard two maids talking quietly in the hallway. "Did you hear what they're saying? It seems the carpenter isn't as honest as he seems," one whispered. "I always thought he was too good to be true," the other replied. "Who would have thought he was stealing right under our noses?" John felt his stomach turn. He knew the rumors were spreading, but hearing it directly from the maids' mouths left him shaken. Back in the workshop, he tried to focus on his work, but the feeling of injustice haunted him. How could anyone think that he, a man who had always valued honesty, could be capable of stealing? Meanwhile, Mrs. Isabella, who had always been fair and cautious, began hearing the rumors. Disturbed, she decided that she needed to clarify the situation quickly. She knew that John was a good worker, but the suspicions cast on him could not be ignored. After reflecting on what to do, she summoned John for a conversation in her office. When John was called, his heart raced. He knew something was wrong, but he had no idea how serious the situation was. Upon entering Mrs. Isabella's office, he found her with a serious expression he had never seen before. "John," Mrs. Isabella began with a firm voice, "I've heard some disturbing rumors about you. Some valuable materials from the mansion are missing, and there are those who say you might be involved." John was stunned. Never in his life had he been accused of something so serious. "Mrs. Isabella, I swear I have nothing to do with this," he said, feeling the weight of the injustice. "I would never do something like that. I work here with complete honesty." Mrs. Isabella observed him for a few moments, trying to discern the truth in his words. She wanted to believe John, but she knew that, as the person responsible for the mansion, she needed to investigate thoroughly before making any decisions. "John, I want to believe you," she said in a softer tone, "but I need to investigate further. Until then, I'll have to suspend you from your duties. It's not an easy decision, but it's necessary until everything is clarified." With a heavy heart, John left the room, feeling as if the world was crashing down on him. He knew that his reputation was at stake and that he would need to fight to prove his innocence. At home, he tried to hide the truth from Peter, but the boy, sensitive to his father's state, sensed something was wrong. "Dad, you're sad?" Peter said, hugging John as he tried to distract himself with the television. "What happened?" John, not knowing how to explain the complexity of the situation to a child, simply smiled sadly and replied, "Don't worry, son. It's just a problem at work. But I'll solve it." That night, while Peter slept, John reflected on what was happening. He knew that someone was trying to frame him, but he couldn't understand why. What he did know was that he needed to find a way to clear his name and protect his and his son's future. John's suspension brought a cloud of uncertainty and despair over his life. He knew he needed to act, but the weight of the false accusations and the distrust he began to feel from those around him left him increasingly anxious. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming, and John felt that the only thing keeping him strong was Peter's presence. Every look of concern from his son, every word of encouragement, was a reminder that he couldn't give up. That night, after Peter fell asleep, John stayed up for hours, reflecting on what could have gone wrong. He mentally reviewed every day of work at the mansion, trying to pinpoint the moment when things started to fall apart. The small sabotages, the suspicious glances, Alfred's poisoned words. Everything indicated that someone was plotting against him, but how could he prove it? John knew that returning to the mansion would be difficult, but he needed to try to find out more about what was going on. The next day, he decided to go retrieve some of his personal tools he had left in the workshop. Upon arriving, he was greeted with curious and suspicious looks from the other employees. The news of his suspension had already spread like wildfire, and the mansion, which once seemed just a workplace, had now turned into an emotional battlefield. As he walked through the corridors, he noticed that Alfred was watching him from a distance, with a victorious smile on his face. That irritating smile was confirmation that something was very wrong. John felt his blood boil, but he knew it wouldn't do any good to confront Alfred without evidence. "Look who's back. Can't stay away, can you?" Alfred taunted, approaching John with an air of superiority. "I'm just here to get my tools," John replied, trying to stay calm. Sure, Alfred said, feigning understanding. "Just make sure you don't leave with anything more than you brought." Alfred's words, loaded with sarcasm, hit John like a knife. He knew he needed to leave before he said or did something he would regret. He grabbed his tools and left the mansion, but the weight of the injustice wouldn't leave his mind. At home, John spent the night turning over the events of the past few days in his mind. He knew that Alfred was behind the accusations, but how could he prove it? Every detail seemed to fit into a sinister puzzle, but John still didn't have all the pieces. With each passing day, the feeling of despair grew. Meanwhile, at the mansion, Mrs. Isabella was also uncomfortable with the situation. She knew John well enough to believe he wasn't the type of person to commit a crime, but the evidence pointed against him. Uncertain, she decided to call in a security specialist to review the monitoring systems and analyze the evidence more thoroughly. The specialist, a man named Charles, was known for his precision and discretion. He spent days reviewing security cameras, material records, and interviewing employees, always looking for any inconsistencies. And then he found something curious. In one of the security recordings, he saw Alfred entering John's workshop at times that didn't match work hours. In another, he noticed that Alfred was handling some materials that would later be reported as missing. This raised a red flag. Charles began connecting the dots and realized that Alfred seemed to be everywhere problems arose. Charles decided to investigate John's background further. When he discussed the matter with Mrs. Isabella, he mentioned that the carpenter seemed like an honest man with a difficult life story. She then shared something she had discovered during her own research. John was the son of a close friend of her family, someone she knew from her childhood but who had lost everything in a tragic accident. This revelation was a shock to Mrs. Isabella. Now, more than ever, she needed to make sure she was doing the right thing. Charles continued his investigation, focusing on proving John's innocence and Alfred's possible guilt. The more he dug, the more evidence emerged that the manager was behind the accusations. Meanwhile, John, still suspended and unaware of the ongoing investigation, tried to keep his head up. Each day away from working at the mansion felt like a burden, but he wouldn't give up so easily. He needed to fight for his honor and for the sake of his son. Finally, after gathering all the necessary evidence, Charles called Mrs. Isabella for a meeting. She listened intently as he presented the case. The pieces began to fit together, and the truth, once hidden, finally came to light. John had been the victim of a carefully planned setup, and Alfred, the true culprit, was about to face the consequences of his actions. Mrs. Isabella, now aware of the true story behind the accusations against John, decided it was time to act. She couldn't allow such an injustice to continue tarnishing the atmosphere of her home. With the evidence provided by Charles, she prepared a meeting with all the mansion's employees. The idea was to confront Alfred and, at the same time, restore John's dignity in front of everyone. That morning, John was at home, unaware of what was happening at the mansion. Since his suspension, he had felt powerless, but he knew he couldn't give up. When he received a call from Mrs. Isabella, asking him to return to the mansion for an urgent meeting, he felt a mix of relief and anxiety. Could this be the opportunity to clear his name? Upon arriving at the mansion, John was greeted by Mrs. Maria, who gave him a meaningful look. "Everything will be all right, John. The truth always comes out," she said. holding his hand for a moment before guiding him to the living room, where all the employees were already gathered. Mrs. Isabella was standing, with Charles by her side and a serious expression. Alfred, on the other hand, was sitting in an armchair at the back, trying to appear indifferent, but the tension was visible on his face. I've called everyone here today because we need to clarify a very serious situation that has shaken the peace in our home. Mrs. Isabella began in a firm voice. Recently, John was accused of theft and dishonesty. These accusations have tarnished his reputation and caused distrust among all of us. However, after careful investigation, we discovered that the evidence against him was planted. John is innocent. A murmur spread through the room. The employees looked at each other, surprised by the revelation. Alfred, for his part, felt his stomach turn. He hadn't expected his manipulations to be uncovered so quickly. Charles, please explain what you found, Mrs. Isabella requested. The specialist stepped forward and began detailing his investigation, showing the recordings and records that incriminated Alfred. The evidence was clear. Alfred had manipulated the situation to incriminate John, driven by jealousy and fear of losing his status at the mansion. Alfred, do you have anything to say in your defense? Mrs. Isabella asked, looking directly at the manager, whose expression had changed from disdain to despair. Alfred slowly stood up, realizing he was cornered. The entire room was silent, waiting for his reaction. He took a deep breath and, in a last-ditch effort to save himself, tried to turn the situation around. Mrs. Isabella, everything I did was for the good of the mansion, he began, his voice trembling. I was worried about the direction things were taking. John seemed to be getting too close to you, and I feared he might be taking advantage of your kindness. Yes, maybe I overreacted, but I did it to protect you and this house. Protect me? Mrs. Isabella retorted in disbelief. You used my trust to harm an innocent man, a man who actually has a deep connection with my family. Your selfishness and ambition almost destroyed the life of someone who just wanted to work honestly. Alfred, now speechless, felt the weight of his actions. He knew that his justifications were not enough to erase what he had done. The atmosphere in the room was one of absolute reproach, and he realized that he had lost not only the respect of others but also his position at the mansion. For a long time, I trusted you, Alfred, Mrs. Isabella continued, but now I see that trust was misplaced. However, I believe that everyone deserves a second chance. That's why I'm giving you one last opportunity to redeem yourself under supervision. But understand, any other slip, and you will be out of this house forever. Alfred simply nodded, aware that he was hanging by a thread. He knew that his position at the mansion would never be the same again, and that the constant vigilance would be a daily reminder of his failure. Mrs. Isabella then turned to John, who had been observing everything with a mix of relief and emotion. John, she said, approaching the carpenter, I want to apologize for everything that happened. You were wronged, but the truth has prevailed. If you're still willing, I'd like you to continue working here. I fully trust you and want you to know that this house will always be open to you and your son. John, moved, couldn't hold back his tears. Mrs. Isabella, I'm the one who should be thanking you, he replied, his voice choked with emotion. I never wanted anything more than to do my job to the best of my ability. I'm glad to know you believe in me. I'll continue here with great pleasure. The tension that had hung in the air began to dissipate, giving way to a feeling of renewal. John felt that, finally, the dark clouds that had hovered over his life were lifting, and a new light was beginning to shine on his path. With the situation clarified and tensions calmed, life at Mrs. Isabella's mansion began to return to normal, although a new sense of vigilance and prudence had settled among the employees. Alfred, now under intense supervision, performed his duties in a reserved manner, avoiding any confrontation. He knew he was walking a tightrope, and any misstep would mean his end at the mansion. John, on the other hand, returned to work with renewed energy. He felt that, despite the storm he had weathered, the situation had strengthened him. Furthermore, the connection he began to develop with Mrs. Isabella brought up memories and feelings he had buried long ago. One day, after finishing restoring an old chair, John was surprised by Mrs. Isabella, who entered the workshop with an introspective expression. "John, I wanted to talk to you about something I recently discovered," she said, pulling up a chair to sit beside him. "Of course, Mrs. Isabella. I'm all ears," he replied, curious. She took a deep breath before beginning. "You know that I've always been someone who values truth and justice, and that's why I insisted on thoroughly investigating the accusations against you. During this investigation, I ended up discovering something about your past, something that deeply touched me." John watched her, intrigued. "I discovered that you are the son of a close friend of my family, Mr. Anthony Baxter. When I was a child, my father and he were very close. I remember him as a man of integrity and dedication, who always did his best to help others. The news of his tragic accident shook me at the time, and I never knew what happened to his family afterward, until now." John was silent for a moment, absorbing Mrs. Isabella's words. Hearing his father's name mentioned after so many years brought back childhood memories, happier times before everything fell apart. He finally understood why he had always felt an inexplicable connection to the mansion and its owner. "My father always spoke of Mr. Augustus, your father, with great affection," John said, his voice thick with emotion. "After the accident, our lives changed completely. My mother tried to keep everything in order, but things became difficult, and we ended up moving to a smaller town, far from here. Since then, I've been fighting to rebuild my life, especially after losing my wife. Everything I've done has been for my son." Mrs. Isabella listened attentively, feeling a deep empathy for John. She realized that there was more at stake than just the restoration of old furniture. There was an invisible yet strong bond that connected their stories. "John, when I discovered who you really are, I felt it was my duty to do something to honor your father's memory and also to help you and your son. I know things have been difficult for you, but I want you to know that you're not alone. If there's anything I can do to help improve your life and Peter's, please let me know." John was moved by Mrs. Isabella's generosity. Throughout his life, he had become accustomed to fighting alone. But now, for the first time, he felt that someone was willing to extend a hand. He thought for a moment before responding. "Mrs. Isabella, I thank you from the bottom of my heart for your offer. What I want most is to give my son a dignified life and teach him to be an honest man, as my father taught me. If you could help me ensure that Peter has a better future, that would be more than I could ask for." Mrs. Isabella smiled, feeling that she had found a new mission in her life. "Let's do it together, John. I've been thinking a lot about how I can contribute to the community, and I think we can turn this mansion into something more than just a residence. I want to create a vocational training center here, where young people like Peter can learn trades, like carpentry, and have a better future. And who better to teach carpentry than you?" John was surprised by the proposal, but at the same time he felt a warmth in his heart. The idea of passing on his knowledge to the next generation and helping shape the future of other young people was something he had never considered, but now it made perfect sense. "It would be an honor, Mrs. Isabella. I don't even know how to thank you for this opportunity." "You don't need to thank me, John. We're giving back to life what it gave us in one way or another. And I know your father would be proud to see the man you've become." With that, the transformation of the mansion began to take shape. John and Mrs. Isabella, now united by a common goal, began planning the changes to come. The mansion, once just a symbol of wealth and power, was about to become a place of hope and renewal for many. The following months brought a new energy to Mrs. Isabella's mansion. The plan to turn the space into a vocational training center quickly took shape, thanks to John's dedication, who approached the project with the same passion he had for carpentry. The old property, once a symbol of an era of opulence and isolation, was now becoming a place of learning, opportunity, and renewal. The workshops were renovated and adapted to receive students, and soon news of the new center spread throughout the town of New Haven. Young people from different backgrounds began enrolling in the courses offered, eager to learn a trade that could provide them with a more stable future. The initiative attracted the attention of residents in the region, who saw the mansion as a beacon of hope. John, who had once faced distrustful and prejudiced looks, was now respected and admired by everyone. His role as the lead carpentry instructor not only gave him the opportunity to share his knowledge, but also to shape the lives of many young people who, like him, once needed guidance. Peter, his son, also felt the positive impact of the changes. He began attending the workshops, learning his father's trade and showing a natural talent for carpentry. The time they spent together at the mansion further strengthened the bond between father and son, bringing back the joy that had long seemed lost. Mrs. Isabella, observing John's and the other students' development, felt fulfilled. The transformation of the mansion was a reflection of her own transformation. For years, she had managed the property with a certain detachment, but now she saw it with a greater purpose. The connection she had established with John and the community at large had brought a new meaning to her life. One afternoon, after a long training session with the students, John met Mrs. Isabella in the mansion's garden. They walked slowly, enjoying the view while discussing the project's next steps. "John," Mrs. Isabella began with a smile on her face, "I never imagined the mansion could be transformed in such a profound way. Seeing these young people learn and grow here, under your guidance, is one of the greatest accomplishments of my life." "Mrs. Isabella, if I may say so, all of this was only possible thanks to your vision and generosity," John replied. "I could never have imagined that my life would change so much since I started working here. And to think it all started with a simple invitation to restore some furniture. Sometimes the greatest transformations start with the smallest steps," she reflected. "Life surprises us, John, and I'm happy we found this new mission together. I feel that this has also brought me closer to my own history and helped me rediscover values that had been dormant." As they walked, the sound of tools being used in the workshops echoed through the garden, a constant reminder of the work they were doing. The vocational training center was not just a project. It was a legacy they were building together, something that would undoubtedly impact future generations. Alfred, who still worked at the mansion, had changed significantly since the confrontation. The weight of distrust and the responsibility under supervision had made him reflect on his actions. He now remained more reserved, focusing on his tasks and avoiding any conflict. Although still under Mrs. Isabella's watchful eye, he seemed to have learned his lesson and, in a way, was beginning to redeem himself little by little. Later that afternoon, John returned home with Peter, tired but happy. As he sat in the living room, he watched his son, who seemed eager to show off a small bench he had built during the class. "Dad, look, I made this today with the wood you gave me. Is it good?" John took the bench, carefully examining every detail. He smiled, proud of his son's work. "It's excellent, Peter. You have talent just like your grandfather had. He would be very proud of you." Peter smiled, pleased with the compliment. "One day I want to be as good as you, Dad, and help others too." "You're already on the right path, my son. Keep going, and you'll be even better." That night, as John reflected on everything that had happened in the past few months, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. Life had been hard on him, but now, finally, he saw the fruits of his perseverance and honesty. The mansion, which had once been a scene of distrust and manipulation, was now a place of growth, learning, and renewal. And so, the story of John, the carpenter unjustly accused, turned into a journey of redemption and transformation, not only for him but for everyone around him. His response, his attitude in the face of adversity, not only changed his destiny but also that of an entire community. And in that new beginning, It was clear that sometimes the greatest struggles in life lead us to the most unexpected paths, where we find not only justice but also purpose and renewal.